Fall is nearing its denouement, but I spent some of this season visiting my mom, whose love of autumn I inherited and whose hearty dining table became my initial workstation for another piece of my 18th century autumn ensemble, a lined wool cloak. I'm using Cannock's Corner short woman's cloak pattern with some adjustments such as aligning and ditching the collar band. I will be hand sewing this project as the directions highly recommend it and I didn't feel like lugging my sewing machine on my vacation. The wool is a lovely rust broadcloth from Burnley and Trowbridge. This cloak calls for 2 gores, which are triangular bits of fabric that gradually add width on either side of the main piece. Gores are quite common in historical garments because it allows the maker to cut their fabric strategically to achieve the desired fullness and minimize fabric waste. Once the gores are pinned, I use a back stitch to secure them with waxed linen thread that's also from Burnley and Trowbridge. I then open up and hem down the seam allowance of the gores to make them nice and flat. This wool is quite thick, so a nice, neat stitch is nearly invisible, especially from the other side. After the gores are attached, the pattern piece gives a guide depending on the attachment method you use for evening out the bottom of the cloak, as the gores tend to add some asymmetrical length. I mark this line with a chalk pencil and then cut along the marking. Since I'm adding a lining, I need to repeat the same steps with the main body and gores with the lining fabric, which is a polyester satin from Mood Fabrics called Sienna. Lining a cloak, especially one made of broadcloth, is not necessary as the raw edges won't fray, but I have quite sensitive skin and know that it'll be much happier with a silkier textile close to it. The satin is a bit trickier to work with than the smooth but stout wool, so I'm ironing open the seam allowances so that it lies flat. I'm leaving the edges raw, however, as they will safely live on the inside of the cloak. Now that the main and lining body pieces are assembled, I lay them wrong side to wrong side, or inside to inside if you prefer the term. I then match up the gore seams and pin those in place, then pin up the rest of the side. To bind the side edges, which will also help secure the main and lining fabrics together, I'm using wool twill tape, also from Burnley and Trowbridge, so I cut a strip to the length of the side of the cloak. I started pinning the tape to the fabric, matching the raw edges with the center line of the twill tape. But I actually ended up taking this out and basting the main and lining fabrics together and repinning the tape. In a conversation about basting with a fellow costumer, they mentioned they never regret basting, but often regret not basting, so remember to baste. After the tape was reapplied, I used a hem stitch to attach it to one side. And don't worry, my cloak didn't shrink. I'm working on binding the hood as well. Once it is sewn down on one side, flip the garment over, fold the tape over the raw edge, and then sew that down as well. Well, I'm back home after a lovely visit, and since it took me a few days to unpack my sewing things, I needed to give the cloak pieces a good ironing. This also helped sort out any fabric fiddliness before working on the hem and attaching the hood. The top and bottom edges of the fabric ended up being slightly off, so I had to trim the excess fabric from the lining to match the mane. I then basted the layers together. For the bottom of the cloak, I basted about an inch up so that I could turn in the hem. And hemming is what comes next. I tucked in the satin so that about 1/8 of an inch of wool shows on the inside. If the fabric allows, this tactic helps keep the lining from rolling to the outside. Now it's time to prep the hood, including ironing, pinning, trimming extra lining fabric, and basting it all together. To transform this flat piece of fabric into a hood, it is folded together right side to right side and then sewn with a back stitch on the opposite side of the binding, leaving about a 4-inch opening towards where the fold begins. Trim the seam allowance down, open it up, and hem it down in the same fashion as the gores for the wool body piece. Remember that opening we left in the hood? The next step is to use a running stitch along that edge to gather the opening. I then bound the raw edges with some remaining twill tape, though this required a lot of finagling as the original pattern leaves this edge raw as wool broadcloth won't fray. But because of my lining, that isn't an option here. The hood and the main body are ready to be attached. The Canucks corner pattern calls for a collar to be added at this stage as well, but I decided to forgo that since I didn't love the look of it. Instead, I lay the body on top of the hood, right side to right side, and pleat it to fit, using my beloved craft clips to adjust the sizing of the pleats as I go. As much as I love my craft clips, they can't stay there forever, so I begin to sew down what they are holding together. I use a back stitch to accomplish this. And despite what this sped up video would have you think, it takes a while as I'm working with some pretty thick layers at this point. I always use a thimble when I hand sew, but when dealing with additional thickness, I also like to use these rubber grips made by Cloak that make it easier to work the needle through the fabrics. For a clean finish, I stitched down a strip of satin over the seam allowance of the pleats. The final phase before some frolicking can happen is to add the ties, in this case, strips of the wool to just inside the garment's front opening. With the cloak now finished, I'm outfitted for an adventure. So into the woods we go. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below describing your ideal outfit for an adventure into the woods.